The camera keeps rolling when everything else stops, capturing the final moments of people who were behind the lens, caught directly in its frame, or still holding it when their story suddenly ended. Welcome back to Blunder Vault, where today we're opening 12 documented cases, each tied to a real photograph, a real date, and a real story, and examining them one haunting shutter click at a time. Case 1. The Final Exposure. There are photographs that capture a moment, and then there are photographs that capture the final moments of the person behind the camera. May 25th, 1954, Northern Vietnam. Robert Capa was 40 years old, already one of the most famous war photographers alive. He had covered conflicts across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, and his images from Omaha Beach had helped define the visual memory of D-Day. Capa believed in getting close, dangerously close. There was a philosophy attached to his work. When a photograph isn't good enough, get closer. But on this morning, that instinct would become fatal. Capa was traveling with a French military column between Nam Ding and Tai Binh, documenting soldiers moving through the countryside during the First Indochina War. The scene appeared almost routine. Soldiers advanced through open farmland, while the road stretched behind them. Yet beneath that ordinary landscape was something they couldn't see: mines. Capa left the road and moved closer to the troops, carrying his camera as he walked through the field. He was doing what he had done throughout his career, placing himself inside the story rather than watching it from a safe distance. Then, without warning, a landmine exploded beneath him. The photographer who had spent years recording the dangers faced by soldiers had suddenly become a victim of the same war he was documenting. Capa was mortally wounded and died that day. He was 40, but his camera had survived. When the film was later developed, the photographs showed no explosion, no final struggle, and no dramatic farewell. Instead, they showed soldiers moving through the landscape, fields stretching into the distance, and an ordinary military operation continuing almost as if nothing had happened. And that's what makes these images so unsettling. They don't look like the end. They look completely normal, but we know what happened next. We know that somewhere between those frames, Robert Capa took his final steps. His photographs survived the danger he had entered. He did not. There was no final portrait of Capa. No photograph announcing that the story was over. Just a field, a group of soldiers, and a camera that kept recording after the man holding it was gone. The war continued. The soldiers continued forward. And the photographs remained behind as the last visual traces of a photographer who had spent his life moving closer to history, until history finally moved closer to him. Case 2. The chaplain's frame. Sometimes the most powerful photograph from a death is not the moment someone dies, it is the moment immediately after, when everyone around them realizes there is nothing left to do. November 4th, 1965, near Chu Lai, South Vietnam. Dickie Chappelle was already a veteran of war photography when she arrived in Vietnam. Born Georgette Louise Meyer, she had spent years deliberately placing herself where the fighting was happening, covering conflicts from the Pacific to Europe and North Africa. She wasn't there to observe war from behind a safe distance. She went with the troops. On that November morning, Chappelle was moving with a Marine patrol through dangerous terrain. The men were advancing in single file, watching the ground and the surrounding vegetation for anything that might signal a trap. Then the man directly ahead of her triggered a concealed explosive device. The blast tore through the patrol. Chappelle was struck in the neck by shrapnel and suffered a fatal injury. In a matter of minutes, the woman who had spent her career photographing other people's experiences of war was gone, but another photographer was there. Henry Hewitt, himself a combat photographer, was moving with the same patrol. In the confusion that followed, he lifted his camera. What he captured was not the explosion itself, it was something quieter. A Navy chaplain kneeling beside Chappelle, performing the last rites as she lay on the ground where she had fallen. Think about what that means. Chappelle had spent years making images so people far away could see what war looked like up close. She photographed fear, exhaustion, destruction, and the people living through all of it. But she never got to photograph this moment. Someone else had to make that final image. And Hewitt's photograph does something that a picture of the explosion never could. It slows everything down. There is no battlefield spectacle, no heroic pose. Just a chaplain, a fallen correspondent, and the terrible stillness that follows violence. Chappelle became the first American woman working as a war correspondent to be killed in Vietnam. Her story is remembered not because she sought danger for its own sake, but because she believed the public had a right to see what happened on the battlefield. And perhaps that is why Hewitt's photograph remains so difficult to forget. For once, Dickie Chappelle wasn't the person behind the camera. She was the subject inside someone else's frame. The woman who spent her life making sure the world could see war had finally become an image of what war could take away. Case 3. The lens that kept turning. What if a camera continued recording after the person behind it was gone? September 9, 1985. Bangkok, Thailand. Neil Davis had spent more than 2 decades filming conflict across Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos. He had built a reputation for moving toward danger while others were trying to escape it. Then Bangkok erupted. A group of military officers attempted to overthrow the Thai government, and fighting broke out across the city. Davis and his longtime sound recordist, Bill Latch, went toward the unrest to document what was happening. It was the kind of decision Davis had made throughout his career: get close enough to show the world what was really happening. Near the Public Relations Department building, government forces opened fire on the rebels. A tank shell struck the area where Davis and Latch were standing. Davis was killed instantly. Latch was also fatally wounded. But what happened next is what makes this case so haunting. Davis's camera had been recording the scene. When the blast hit, the camera was knocked to the ground, but it did not stop. The man behind the lens was gone. The lens kept watching. The surviving footage captured the confusion and aftermath around the fallen journalists, turning Davis's own camera into an accidental witness to the final moments of his career. Think about that for a second. A camera normally depends on a person. Someone holds it. Someone frames the shot. Someone decides when the recording ends. Davis never made that final choice. The equipment simply continued doing the one thing it had been brought there to do: record. There was no farewell, no final message, no warning that the story was about to end. Just a camera on the ground, still capturing the world around it. And perhaps that is what makes the footage so difficult to forget. Davis went to Bangkok to document a political crisis. Instead, his own equipment preserved the scene surrounding his death. His life ended in seconds. The footage continued. The story continued. The city continued moving. But the man who had spent his life making sure history was seen was no longer there to tell it. 3 files down, 9 remain. And if you think a camera can't get any closer to the truth, wait until file 4. Subscribe to Blunder Vault if you want to keep following the archive. Case 4. The Ash Tide. What if the people who understood a deadly force better than almost anyone else still couldn't predict where it would strike? June 3, 1991. Mount Unzen, on Japan's island of Kyushu. Katia and Maurice Croft were French volcanologists who had spent more than 20 years following eruptions around the world. They didn't study volcanoes from a safe distance. They walked toward them, filming lava, documenting eruptions, and showing audiences what these mountains looked like up close. By 1991, Mount Unzen had been erupting for months, and scientists were monitoring its activity. Near the volcano, researchers, journalists, and other observers gathered in areas they believed were outside the immediate danger zone. Among them was Harry Glicken, an American volcanologist studying volcanic hazards. Then the mountain changed everything. A pyroclastic flow suddenly surged down the slope, a rapidly moving mixture of superheated gas, ash, and volcanic debris. It moved far faster than anyone nearby could escape. The flow swept into the observation area, killing more than 40 people, including Katia and Maurice Croft and Harry Glicken. But the most unsettling part of this story isn't simply how they died, it's who they were. The Crofts had spent their lives studying exactly the kind of danger that eventually killed them. They understood volcanoes. They respected them. They knew the ground could change without warning. Yet knowledge has limits. You can study a force for decades and still not know precisely what it will do in the next few seconds. Their cameras and film archives survived, leaving behind decades of images from the very world they had devoted their lives to documenting. Those photographs and films became part of their legacy, allowing people to see the extraordinary beauty and immense power that had drawn them toward volcanoes in the first place. Their story is not simply about scientists taking a risk. It is about the uncomfortable boundary between understanding nature and controlling it. The Crofts spent their careers approaching that boundary, trying to make the invisible dangers of volcanoes visible to everyone else. At Mount Unzen, the danger crossed that boundary first. The mountain changed faster than human prediction could respond. Their lives ended there, but the cameras they carried left something behind. a visual record of two people who spent their lives looking directly into the unknown. Case 5. The mile-wide turn. The most dangerous thing about a tornado isn't always the wind. Sometimes, it's the moment the storm changes direction before anyone on the ground realizes it. May 31st, 2013. El Reno, Oklahoma. Tim Samaras was one of America's most respected storm researchers, known for treating tornadoes as a scientific problem rather than a spectacle. He designed instruments that could be placed near violent storms to collect data while keeping people as far from danger as possible. That evening, he was chasing with his son, Paul Samaras, who documented their work, and their longtime colleague, Carl Jung. Then the supercell produced something enormous. The tornado near El Reno expanded to roughly 2.5 miles wide, making it one of the largest tornadoes ever documented. At that scale, the storm became difficult to read from the ground. What looked like a defined path could change within moments, and the surrounding wind field could extend far beyond what the visible funnel suggested. Tim's team was experienced. They understood the risks. They had spent years learning how storms behaved and how quickly conditions could change. But this tornado did something especially dangerous. It changed direction unexpectedly. The shift was so abrupt that crews nearby had almost no time to respond. The Samaras team found themselves caught inside the tornado's broader wind field. Their vehicle was thrown from the area, and all 3 men were killed. Tim was 55. Paul was 24. Carl Jung was 45. Their deaths shocked the storm-chasing community because this wasn't a group that treated tornadoes casually. And they were researchers who had built their careers around understanding these storms and developing safer ways to study them. And that's what makes the El Reno case so unsettling. Experience can reduce risk, but it cannot remove uncertainty. The storm did not care how much they knew about it. Instruments and cameras were recovered afterward, leaving behind the final physical traces of a research team that had spent years trying to capture what happens inside a tornado. Their work had always been about one goal: get close enough to collect the data, but far enough away to survive. On May 31st, that margin disappeared. The tornado's path shifted, their warning window vanished. And the people who had spent their lives studying these storms became part of the history they were trying to understand. Their instruments recorded data, their cameras documented the storm. But the final lesson was one no scientist wants to learn. Sometimes nature changes faster than human judgment can react. Case 6. The Reef's Answer. What if the animal that ends a wildlife filmmaker's life isn't hunting him at all? September 4th, 2006, Bat Reef, off the coast of Queensland, Australia. Steve Irwin had built his career around getting close to animals most people were taught to fear. Crocodiles, snakes, sharks, and countless other species became part of his work, with cameras following almost every encounter. That afternoon, Irwin was underwater filming for Ocean's Deadliest with his crew. A short-tailed stingray was resting on the seafloor, and Irwin moved above it to capture footage. The animal appeared calm. Then everything changed in seconds. The stingray reacted defensively, driving its barbed tail upward. The barb struck Irwin in the chest, causing a fatal injury. His crew immediately pulled him from the water and began emergency treatment, but the wound was catastrophic. Irwin died shortly afterward. What makes the story so unsettling is what the animal was actually doing. It wasn't hunting him. It wasn't pursuing him. It was responding to something it perceived as a threat. That matters because Irwin had spent his life teaching audiences to understand wildlife rather than simply fear it. He knew wild animals could react instinctively when they felt threatened. But knowing that and surviving the reaction are two very different things. His career had been built on closing the distance between humans and wildlife. The closer he got, the more extraordinary the footage became. But the same closeness also reduced the margin for error. Cameras were recording during the encounter, and footage of the incident did exist. It was never released publicly, however, and has remained private out of respect for Irwin's family. So the world never saw those final images. What remains is the testimony of those who were there, and the knowledge that the man who spent his life bringing wild animals into people's homes died during one of the encounters he had dedicated his career to documenting. The stingray didn't need to be a monster. It only needed one defensive movement, and beneath the surface of Bat Reef, that single movement changed everything. 6 cases opened, 6 lives documented. If one has stayed with you, leave the case number below, and subscribe to Blunder Vault before the next file, because the cameras are still rolling. Case 7. The street that closed. What happens when the people behind the camera suddenly become part of the story they're documenting? April 20th, 2011, Misrata, Libya. The city was caught in the middle of the Libyan civil war, with fighting tearing through streets held by opposing forces. Among the journalists covering the siege were Chris Hondros, a Pulitzer Prize finalist for Getty Images, and Tim Hetherington, the photographer and filmmaker known for his work in Afghanistan and the documentary Restrepo. Both men had spent years working in dangerous conflicts, moving close to the fighting so audiences far away could understand what was happening on the ground. That day, they were working alongside photographers Guy Martin and Michael Christopher Brown in an area where incoming fire was a constant threat. Then an explosive projectile struck near the group. Hetherington suffered a devastating leg injury and died before he could receive the treatment he needed. Hondros suffered a severe head injury and was taken to hospital, where he died several hours later. Martin and Brown survived. The tragedy was not that they misunderstood the danger. They knew exactly what kind of place they were in. They had spent years documenting war and had witnessed its consequences firsthand. But experience cannot make a battlefield predictable. One moment, they were observers. The next, the violence they had been photographing had reached them. That's what makes this case so haunting. Their job was to stand close enough to danger that people thousands of miles away could see the reality of war. Yet on that street in Misrata, the distance between witness and victim disappeared. Hondros and Hetherington had spent their careers giving faces and meaning to people caught inside conflicts. Their photographs and films continued to do that after they were gone. But their final chapter carried a different message. Sometimes the camera cannot remain outside the story. Sometimes the person holding it becomes part of the history being recorded. On April 20th, the street they entered to document the war became the place where their own stories ended. Case 8. The feed that kept running. Millions of people turn on the television expecting the ordinary. On August 26, 2015, an ordinary morning broadcast became something no newsroom could have prepared for. Allison Parker was 24, a reporter for WDBJ-7. Adam Ward was 27, her cameraman. That morning, they were at Bridgewater Plaza near Smith Mountain Lake, Virginia, filming a live segment about local tourism. It was routine television. A reporter, a camera, a guest, and viewers watching from homes across the region. Then the situation changed in seconds. A former employee of the station approached the crew and opened fire. The station's camera was still broadcasting. Viewers watching live television saw the attack unfold before the feed was cut. Parker and Ward were killed at the scene. The woman they were interviewing survived. What makes this case especially disturbing isn't simply that cameras were present. It's that the audience was connected to the event as it happened, without knowing what they were seeing until afterward. There was no documentary crew deliberately recording a historic moment. No photographer standing nearby expecting danger. This was a morning news broadcast that had been designed to feel completely normal. Then reality broke through the frame. Ward had been doing what cameramen do every day, keeping the shot steady while someone else tells the story. Parker had been doing her job as a reporter, speaking directly to viewers at home. Within seconds, both were gone. The camera, however, had captured what happened. Another camera had also been involved. The attacker recorded his own actions separately. That created an unusually extensive visual record of the crime. Although the footage itself is not something that needs to be shown to understand what happened, the most haunting detail is simpler. The broadcast was never supposed to become history. It was supposed to be a few minutes of local television about a lake, tourism, and an ordinary morning. Instead, the camera became an unwilling witness. Parker and Ward went to work expecting to report someone else's story. They ended up becoming part of one they never chose. And for viewers watching that morning, the line between television and reality disappeared in real time. The feed stopped. The moment didn't. Case 9. The 73 seconds. The most frightening part of the Challenger disaster is that the danger wasn't invisible. Someone had already warned about it. January 28, 1986, Cape Canaveral, Florida. 7 astronauts climbed aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger, including Krista McAuliffe, a New Hampshire teacher selected from more than 11,000 applicants to become the first private citizen to fly aboard a NASA space mission. Her presence changed the meaning of the launch. Classrooms across America were watching. Students had been told to look at the television and see their teacher become an astronaut. Then Challenger lifted from the pad. For the first moments, everything appeared normal, but the launch had begun under unusually cold conditions, and engineers had already raised serious concerns about the performance of the solid rocket booster seals known as O-rings. The previous evening, engineers from Morton Thiokol had warned that the unusually low temperatures could compromise the seals. The launch decision went forward. 73 seconds after liftoff, the warning became reality. A failure in the right solid rocket booster allowed hot gases to escape, damaging the connection between the booster and the external tank. Challenger broke apart in the sky. All 7 crew members were lost. Millions of people saw the disaster unfold, including children watching from classrooms and families watching at home. But the deepest tragedy wasn't simply that the shuttle failed. It was that the failure had been preceded by warnings, uncertainty, and decisions that should have stopped the launch from proceeding under those conditions. The Challenger story became a landmark in the history of engineering and spaceflight because it exposed something more dangerous than a single broken component. A system in which concerns could be raised, debated, and still fail to prevent catastrophe. Krista McAuliffe had boarded that shuttle, hoping to bring space exploration into classrooms. Instead, the launch became a lesson in risk, communication, and responsibility that nobody had intended to teach. 73 seconds was all it took for a routine broadcast to become history. The cameras kept recording as Challenger disappeared into the sky, and the world watched something that was never supposed to happen. Case 10. The basement shutter. Imagine a camera pointed at a routine transfer, only for history to erupt inside the frame. November 24, 1963, Dallas, Texas. Just 2 days after President John F. Kennedy's assassination, Lee Harvey Oswald was being moved through the basement of Dallas Police Headquarters for transfer to the county jail. Reporters and photographers had gathered because Oswald's case had become one of the biggest stories in America. Then the routine procedure suddenly stopped being routine. As officers escorted Oswald through the basement, nightclub owner Jack Ruby emerged from the crowd and shot him at close range. Television cameras were broadcasting the transfer live, allowing viewers across the country to witness the attack as it happened. Among the photographers covering the scene was Robert H. Jackson of the Dallas Times-Herald. His camera was already raised when Ruby fired. Jackson captured the precise instant of the shooting, freezing a moment that lasted less than a second. The photograph became one of the defining images of the Kennedy assassination aftermath, and later earned Jackson the Pulitzer Prize. Oswald was rushed to Parkland Memorial Hospital, the same hospital where President Kennedy had died only 48 hours earlier. He was pronounced dead that afternoon. What makes this case so remarkable is the role of the cameras. Nobody had gathered in that basement expecting to photograph a killing. They were there to document a prisoner transfer. Yet because the lenses were already pointed toward Oswald, an unexpected act of violence became one of the most recognizable moments ever captured by photojournalism. The image doesn't explain the entire mystery surrounding Kennedy's assassination. It doesn't answer every question about that chaotic week. It simply preserves one undeniable moment: a man being transferred through a crowded basement, a gun suddenly appearing, and a photographer positioned close enough to freeze history between one fraction of a second and the next. Jackson wasn't trying to create an iconic photograph that day. He was doing his job, but sometimes the most powerful images are the ones nobody planned to take. 10 cases are open now. 2 remain, and the final files move away from straightforward violence into something much stranger. Stay with Blundervault, because the last 2 stories are about images that survived for reasons nobody could have predicted. Case 11. The Unrecovered Roll. Somewhere high on Mount Everest, a tiny camera may still be holding an answer that mountaineers have argued about for more than a century. June 8, 1924. George Mallory and 22-year-old Andrew Irvine were making their way toward Everest's summit during Mallory's 3rd attempt to reach the top. Irvine carried a small Kodak Vest pocket camera, the kind of device that could fit easily into a climber's equipment. Far below, teammate Noel Odell watched through a telescope as the clouds briefly opened. He saw 2 figures moving high along the ridge. Then the clouds closed again. Mallory and Irvine never returned. And that disappearance created a mystery that still hasn't been completely settled. Did they reach the summit before they died? The question matters because Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay's 1953 expedition is generally recognized as the first confirmed ascent. If Mallory and Irvine reached the top in 1924, the history of Everest would have to be rewritten. For decades, there was no way to know. Then, in 1999, an expedition searching the mountain discovered Mallory's body, preserved in the ice roughly 2,000 feet below the summit, but the camera Irvine was carrying was nowhere to be found. Irvine's body has never been located, and the camera may still be somewhere high on Everest. That missing object is what keeps the mystery alive. If it were ever recovered, and if its film had somehow survived the extreme conditions for a century, it could potentially reveal what happened during those final hours. Perhaps there could be evidence of a summit attempt. Perhaps there would be nothing conclusive at all. That's what makes the camera so fascinating. It isn't simply an old piece of equipment. It could be the missing witness to one of mountaineering's greatest unanswered questions. Mallory and Irvine disappeared into the clouds in 1924. Their bodies, their route, and their final moments remain only partly understood. Somewhere above the world, the little camera may still be waiting beneath the ice, carrying a roll of film that nobody has seen for more than 100 years. And until that camera is found, the mountain keeps its secret. Case 12. The landing that never ended. Imagine arriving with a camera because you expect nothing unusual. That was the atmosphere at Lakehurst, New Jersey, on May 6, 1937. The Hindenburg was coming in to land, and for the photographers gathered nearby, this was supposed to be another routine assignment: record the arrival, capture a few useful images, and go home. Then the sky changed. As the enormous airship approached its mooring mast, the crew began the final steps of bringing it down. Lines were being handled below. Cameras were already pointed upward. Nothing about the scene suggested that these would become some of the most important photographs of the decade. Then, without warning, the Hindenburg caught fire. What followed lasted only seconds. Flames raced through the airship as the massive structure began collapsing toward the ground. People on board were suddenly trying to escape, while ground personnel ran toward the wreckage. 35 of the 97 people aboard died, along with one member of the ground crew. In total, 36 lives were lost, and the cameras kept recording. Photographers including Sam Shear and Murray Becker had come expecting an ordinary landing. Instead, they captured a disaster unfolding in real time. Nearby, radio reporter Herbert Morrison was recording the arrival for Chicago station WLS. At first, his voice was calm. Then the fire began. His professional narration broke under the shock of what he was witnessing, producing the famous words, "Oh, the humanity." The recording would later become one of the best-known pieces of eyewitness audio in broadcast history. The people behind those cameras had come to document a landing. Instead, they preserved the final moments of an era, and that may be what makes these images so haunting. Nobody pressed the shutter expecting history. They simply happened to be looking when history arrived. The shutter clicked, the moment vanished, and the record remained. Somewhere, these photographs still preserve the final traces of stories that ended without warning. If you want to uncover what those images left behind, subscribe to Blundervault. More forgotten files are still sealed away.